Good afternoon. My name is Lucy Sagu. I'm a second year student here at GSJ in the doctoral department, and I would like to introduce you to our talk. So, just wanted to start with a land acknowledgement that UBC Vancouver stands on the unceded, ancestral, and traditional territory of the Musqueam people. And I have the pleasure of introducing Miss Laleta Davis Mattis. Ms. Laleta Davis Mattis is currently the University Counsel at the University of the West Indies Regional Headquarters, Kingston, Jamaica. Ms. Davis Mattis serves in other capacities at UWI, broadening her role as the University Counsel to encapsulate serving as member of the University of the West Indies Executive Management Team, Company Secretary of the University of West Indies Regional Endowment Fund, Company Secretary to Lumen Consulting, and Director of the University of West Indies Press. Dedicated to her passion for teaching tomorrow's leaders, Mrs. Davis Mattis serves as Adjunct Lecturer in International Environmental Law and Caribbean Environmental Law in Faculty of the Law at Mona Campus of the UWI, University of West Indies in Jamaica. She is also Adjunct Lecturer in the Faculty of Pure and Applied Sciences for the course Law and Policy for Natural Resources Management in the Bachelor of Science in Environmental Management program. Her service to her country cannot be overlooked, as Mrs. Davis Mattis has dedicated much of her life in the service of the government and the people of Jamaica. She is co-chair of the National Council on Reparations and chair of the Culture Committee on the National Commission for UNESCO. She recently served on the board of the Jamaica National Heritage Trust as chair. Prior to these positions, Mrs. Davis Mattis was the executive director of the Jamaican National Heritage Trust and director of the Legal Enforcement and Regulations Division of the National Environment and Planning Agency. Also, Mrs. Davis Mattis has been instrumental in the development of many of Jamaica's environmental policies and for the development of environmental legislation. An epitome of true Jamaican ambassadorship, Ms. Mattis Davis has represented Jamaica in the United Nations Convention in the Law of the Sea and the Convention on Biological Biodiversity, the World Heritage Convention, and the Convention on Underwater Cultural Heritage. She is also a former member of the Legal and Technical Commission to the International Seabed Authority. Most recently, her attention has been focused on the areas of the development of water finds in Jamaica, the mining regulations regarding deep seabed mining legislative development on the management of hazardous chemicals in Jamaica and solid waste management. She is a contributor to the discourse on and development of policy brief on capacity development as a key aspect of a new international agreement on marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, and a recent regional agreement on access to information, public participation, and justice to environmental matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. As a result of her outstanding public service in October 2017, Mrs. Davis Mattis was the recipient of the Order of Distinction in the rank of Commander for her contribution to environmental law and the Jamaica National Heritage Trust. Let's welcome Ms. Davis.
All right, thank you very much for your very generous introduction. Oh, so I'm from Jamaica. And who has been to Jamaica? Okay, great. So I bring warmth, okay? All right, she said much about me. So most of my life really has been in the development of environmental law and jurisprudence. But as you see, I'm actually general counsel for the University of the West Indies. And so generally speaking, I'm really very much involved in law and higher education institutions. So this afternoon, my topic really is on rights of nature, corporate social responsibility, and the role of higher education institutions. And there's a paper that accompanies the presentation, and I'll have that available for you. So perhaps, I'm not sure if it'll be on the website, but you certainly have both the PowerPoint presentation and the paper. So what are we talking about here? So who was Christopher Stone? Christopher Stone was an American jurist who in the early 1970s came up with this thesis, should trees have standing? And we all know in law, just let me give you a little background in law, when it comes down to the concept of standing, it has nothing to do with me standing here. It really means your right to representation in a court of law. That's really what it is. And therefore, he came up with this thesis, should trees have standing, legal rights for natural objects? And so the idea was that trees and natural objects should have the right in a court of law to representation. So how would that happen? In law, they are called legal incompetence. For example, a child in law has no rights to approach a court. So we have developed these legal concepts, for example, by next friend. So somebody else who has legal capacity can represent you in court. And so he advanced the thesis that that's what should happen for natural objects. He didn't, in his thesis, however, include all natural elements. For example, he didn't include all animals, etc. But he focused on the, more or less, not animals, but more on your non-living, not non-living, but more on the non-natural environment in terms of not trees, but not people, and not animals. Sorry about that. Okay, so he said, he noted that there will be resistance to giving the thing rights until it can be seen and valued for itself. And he said it is hard to see it and value it for itself now. Because in essence, what has happened in the development of the world is, when you think of the environment, who places that value? Does a tree come and say, this is my value? Or does the river say, hey, I have a value here? And do the fish say, yes, I have rights to this water and I need clean water? No, they don't speak for themselves, so they are the voiceless. And so what Christopher Stone was advocating was that he knew he would have resistance, but he basically was saying somebody needs to represent those. And we know that there has been a proliferation of non-government organizations seeking to protect the environment, as well as seeking to protect, for example, the unborn fetus. We do have NGOs who advocate for the life of a fetus, for example. And so it's the same concept that has transcended into this discourse. So, of course, among his critics was P.S. Elder, who said, if it cannot matter to cannon or trees if they are irreparably damaged, how are their guardians to know what to argue on their behalf? So, for example, who says a tree doesn't want to say, hey, I've been around for hundreds of years and it's time for me to go? The trees can't speak, and neither can the rivers. So Elder was practically saying, thank you, even if trees want less smog in the air, why would they want it? One answer might be to reduce biological strain and to allow the tree to go bigger and produce more seeds, but equally, the tree could ask that other trees competing with it be cut down. I mean, that's what we do. The survival of the fittest, we don't want the competition because we want to own power as human beings. He was arguing, how do you know what nature really wants? So, and there has been many a discussion on these two concepts, basically featuring whether or not you're going the anthropocentric route, meaning that it is the human being that places value on the environment, or whether or not you're going to go with the biocentric rule, meaning that the environment has value in and of itself. So, in 1972, when I described this as the world meeting in Stockholm, Sweden, to discuss how can we arrest what we have created. And so this is part of the preamble. It says, and this is the 1972 declaration, it says, man is both creature and molder of his environment, which gives him physical sustenance and affords him the opportunity for intellectual, moral, social, and spiritual growth. In the long and tortuous evolution of the human race on this planet, a stage has been reached when, through the rapid acceleration of science and technology, man has acquired the power to transform his environment in countless ways and on an unprecedented scale. Both aspects of man's environment, the natural and the man-made, are essential to his well-being and to the enjoyment of basic human rights, the right to life itself. Now, even in this declaration, it is acknowledging that man has this basic human right, the right to life. Now, in many discourses, judicial scenarios, the right to life traditionally really has been focused on the right to a fair trial, the right not to be hung, the right to life in that concept. But the discourse has developed over the years that even your right to life includes your right to breathe clean air, your right to a healthy environment. And so in order to achieve that right, it therefore means that somebody needs to take care of the environment. So again, it still focuses on us. and the value that we place on the environment so that we can survive. Now, having said all of that, what role do we, especially corporations, play in ensuring that we have a healthy environment? When we talk about pollution and pollution incidents, usually these are all man-made. They are created by corporations, etc. With the high rate of consumerism, we are really the drivers. It's what we want. You know, now we have a proliferation of plastics that's killing us all. But who wants the plastic? We're the ones who purchase plastics. We're the ones who want fast cars. We're the ones who want the technology. So it's all really driven by our own sense of consumerism and what we want. That's really what drives it. And therefore, the question is, what role do corporations play in ensuring that the environment is clean? Now, the truth is, the price of goods and services will be valued based on how corporations see themselves within the environmental construct. Because if you're going to spend a lot of money to ensure that your product is environmentally clean, then that needs to be passed on to somebody else, and that's the consumer. But then we are also willing to pay for these goods and services. So, again, I'm putting the universities within this corporate social construct to see now what role do universities play in this discourse. So, in case of the voiceless, so in the case of nature, the development of the jurisprudence, as I've said before, has been focused on the rights of humans to life and the corresponding rights of the human to take care of the environment, to protect themselves. And this is how corporations come into play, as well as universities. So what do we have? We have regulatory authorities, and we have them everywhere, that have these laws to protect the environment. And how do they do that? They protect the environment by managing human activity. So we talk about sustainable development. And by the way, the environmental discourse is really only a small component of the discourse on sustainable development. Really what it says is decisions on development must take into consideration environmental considerations. Because if you think about it, almost everything that we will do is going to have an impact on the environment. The issue really is, what is the extent of the impact? And of course, the extent to which you may mitigate that impact. And therefore, the regulatory agencies have been charged with the responsibility to manage us so that we can protect the environment. So again, the rights of humans to a healthy environment, and this has been incorporated in constitutions worldwide. Now, interestingly, in 2008, Ecuador took the ultimate step and enacted constitutional provisions that expressly give rights to nature. So here are constitutions are now being developed that are giving rights to voiceless natural environment and voiceless objects. And basically, it acknowledges that nature in all its life forms has a right, nature has a right to exist, to persist, to maintain and to regenerate its vital cycles. It says humans, on the other hand, possess the legal authority to enforce these rights on behalf of ecosystems. And the ecosystem itself, therefore, can be a defendant, which means that the ecosystem now can be represented to enforce those rights. Now, just quickly, the Constitution says where life is reproduced and exists, it has the right to exist, to persist, maintain, and regenerate. Every person, people, community, or nationality will be able to demand the recognitions of rights for nature before the public organisms. The application and interpretation of these rights will follow the related principles established in the Constitution. And of course, the state will therefore have a corresponding responsibility to ensure that this happens. And what's going to happen is that you have to enact laws, right? Because you have to enact laws to regulate human behavior. There's a saying that you can't legislate morality, but you can legislate behavior. So that's what we're doing here. So again, in Ecuador, nature has a right to restoration, and it is independent of the obligation on natural and juridical persons or the state to indemnify the people and the collectives that depend on the natural systems. Because let's take it, let me divert a little. If you have land and you want to develop your land, the legal system dictates that you need some kind of a permit. So that goes to your regulatory provisions. And in that permit, you are told what you can or cannot do. If you have purchased your land in order to benefit you commercially, and the state takes that away because they are being imposed with conditions that actually now deprive you of that right, then in many instances you're entitled to compensation. So it is actually saying that this right to restoration is independent of the obligation to indemnify people and the collectives that depend on the natural systems. So it really is identifying nature almost as a person or a juridical person and saying this component of our lives has its own rights and systems. And therefore you can now legislate to how you actually manage and protect the environment. So one of some of the objects of goals, Bolivia, again, has come to the rescue with constitutional provisions, and that constitution guarantees the regeneration of Mother Earth. The state at its various levels and society, in harmony with the common interest, must ensure the necessary conditions in order that the diverse living systems of Mother Earth may absorb damage, adapt to shocks, and regenerate without significantly altering their structural and functional characteristics. Now, if you think of climate change by itself, the climate change dialogue is no longer a question of whether or not there's climate change or not. We all see it. There is climate change, and you know, there are various models being done to determine, for example, small island developing states. I'm from a small island developing state in the Caribbean, and there are different models that look at, will these islands still exist in the future? When you look at sea level rise and whether or not they will exist, there are some islands in the Maldives, for example, who conducted an experiment. What they did was they conducted their board meeting underwater, just as a way of demonstrating that this thing is for real. So they actually had a board meeting underwater, and to demonstrate, if in the future we really have no Maldives, what are we going to do? And so then you also have the concept of climate refugees. So it's not just people who are running away because they are being persecuted, but the concept of climate refugees is a reality. So I say that to say, when you look at the constitutional provision, which talks about being able to absorb damage, adapt to shocks, and regenerate without significantly altering their structural and cultural characteristics, in a real sense, we have already set some things in motion that we are actually trying to reverse now. And in trying to reverse it, we are also now putting constraints on our own behavioral norms. That's really what we are doing. So we have cars being developed that will run on water. But guess what? Maybe those cars won't be available everywhere, because there are some parts of the world there's no water. So if you're going to have cars running on water, maybe the question will arise, which is more important? Is it the technology, or is it the water that I need? Because there are international agreements actually now being developed to accord rights to water and sanitation. Because there are many things that we take for granted. Many of it come from developed countries, and so we take a lot of things for granted, but the rest of the world is starving. And I usually say to my class, hey, you swim in a pool. You know, you have a pool in your backyard, but that pool has so many gallons of water that there are so many kids around the world who don't even have a glass of, you have to struggle to get a glass of water. And so we take a lot for granted because of our own situations. And sometimes we need to really take a step back out of our own space and look more globally and join the environmental discourse. Again, one of the objects and goals, respect and defend the rights of Mother Earth, and the state and any individual or collective persons must respect, protect, and guarantee the rights for current and future generations. I want to stop a little bit here on the concept of future generations. Now, we mentioned the whole issue before of standing. Now, future generations don't exist. So it's one thing to say that you're going to accord rights to nature. Nature exists, and nature needs to regenerate itself, so you need to take care of nature. But future generations don't exist. We don't know who they are, but they have rights. And that is the concept of intergenerational equity, and is a feature of sustainable development, which means that we must take care of the environment so that future generations can exist. So it may sound like a nice concept on paper, but in a sense it could also be a very nebulous concept because we don't know who they are. But there are judicial systems that actually have accorded rights to natural persons, to unborn generations. And courts have pronounced that yes, there are groups today that can come on behalf of unborn persons. The same way in which you can come to defend the river and the trees. It is the same manner in which you can come in defense of the unborn. And if we don't do that, then there'll be no future. Then all we'll do is read it in books. Well, there are no books anymore for your generation, right? It's all on the internet. In my day, we had to read books. But now it's all on the... Google is our verb, right? So you can always just Google it. Okay, so again with Bolivia, the right to life, and this is not our right to life. This is the right of the natural environment to life. So the right to maintain the integrity of living systems and natural processes that sustain them and capacities and conditions for regeneration. Again, to the diversity of life. And that goes to the right to preservation of differentiation and variety of beings that make up Mother Earth without being genetically altered or structurally modified in an artificial way. And again, that goes to biosafety. So many things are structurally altered. I would say to my student, you don't know what you're eating. And I say that to you, you really don't know what you're eating. So you really need to read labels. And some of your labels will say, or may say, this contains genetically modified organisms. For more information, contact. All right? But you really don't know what you're eating. You might be eating something that you really don't eat. In other words, and I have Adventist students in my class, and I say, oh, you don't eat pork, but you know the value of the pig and what the genes of the pig are used to do. So you may be eating something that is infused with other genetic material. And therefore, again, how do we control this? You have a proliferation of environmental agreements that seek to address almost every single component of your life. And that's really to control that. If it wasn't for the whole concept of ethics, and in institutions we have ethics. In order for your researchers to do some kind of research, they have to go before an ethics committee, because it is the ethics that actually dictate or actually put a stop on the extent to which we can conduct research. Because then we could really, really change this planet. All right, again, nature itself has a right to water. Nature itself has a right to clean air. Nature itself has a right to equilibrium, to restoration, and to pollution-free living. When we talk about pollution-free living, we usually talk about ourselves. Now we're talking about nature having the right to pollution-free living. So, going back now to the rights of nature and corporate social responsibility. So, we know that there is a concept of the green consumer. Who is the green consumer? The green consumer is really the consumer who is really looking at the environment. How is that affecting what I do? Do I eat from a styrofoam container? No, because it's not biodegradable. Do I use certain types of plastic bags? No, because that also is going to harm the environment. For most of us who are either coastal states, including islands and large land masses that have oceans, we know what these things do to the marine environment. And we also know that without the ocean, we are all dead. Because without the ocean, we can't survive. And so the issue is, how do we, by our own levels of consumerism, what we want and what drives what we want, how do we make those decisions that will have an impact on the whole issue of corporate social responsibility? What do we demand from corporations? What do we demand from our manufacturers? What do we demand from our governments? What do we demand when there's an election and a new government is supposed to come in? Is there a green manifesto that says if I'm going to protect the environment, then I'll vote for you? Or is it the extent to which the government will ensure that other goods and services are provided? So these are the things that we are really supposed to be talking about. And only when we begin that kind of introspection will we be able to change our own behavior and change the behavior of others. So corporate social responsibility means something, but not always the same thing. And in a sense, for some companies, they form foundations. So that's what most companies do. And why do you form a foundation? Okay, perhaps I really want to be socially or environmentally responsible. But that's also a way of ensuring that I don't pay the government all the taxes for my profits. Because I can always put it to something else and I'm going to pay less taxes. So there are different mechanisms and strategies that you use. But we're focusing here on the kind of genuine nature of corporate social responsibility and what we should expect from corporations as we are their patrons and their consumers. So then we go to the role of the university. So what is the university? What are we here for? So you're all here and you're going to go out and you're going to get really nice paying jobs, you know, and you're going to start your own businesses too, and you're going to employ. And you may be a manufacturer. You may have a patent on something that's really exciting, but it's going to have an impact on the environment. Or maybe you're going to do something that's going to have a positive impact on the environment, which means that your carbon footprint is going to be less. And the extent to which you impact the environment is going to be less. And perhaps that's where we should be going. So what is the role of university apart from developing pedagogies, creating institutes and centers, and really focusing on research? Because it is not tried to say that university play a major role in the development of societies. Because take the university out, and I guess you would imagine what would happen. If you were to close all universities for the next 5 years, what would happen? Maybe we can't conceive of it now, but it would really have a very negative impact on the global space. So if we have that impact, what is our role with respect to corporate social responsibilities? I just gave 2 examples here. For example, I went on your website and I saw that this institute has a particular program, and I'm sure there are many programs here. And when you look down here, it talks about exploring labor, governance, ethics, business practices, supply relations, company, and environmental benefits. So, of course, this is still a part of our thought processes and how we engage in research. For example, if you're into climate change, we know that there's funding available. If you're into biodiversity protection, there is funding available. But what do we do with the research? And how do we use that research to actually change behavior? Because I'm advocating that universities should actually play a much more common role. So I gave another example from my university where we have a film project, but that's primarily your social responsibility, where this project really goes into an inner city community. In our context, an inner city community is an underprivileged community where goods and services are not as prevalent. Many people are actually maybe below the poverty line. And by the way, below the poverty line is an economic concept. It has nothing to do with being poor or rich. It just means what you can do to survive. So people who live either on the poverty line or below, you perhaps cannot survive on that. But that's really an economic model that is used. So basically, this project really goes in, hones the skills of these young persons so that they themselves can become entrepreneurs in the filmmaking industry. And it has been a very successful project. But these 2 examples are really examples in the case of corporate social responsibility. I'm advocating that we need to step it up a little bit more. So what we need to do is to ensure that we incorporate the concept in our own strategic plans as universities. And not just put them in as policies, but to identify the steps to be taken to achieve the goal. So let's take UBC. I'm sure UBC has a great impact, not just in British Columbia or Vancouver, but Canada and globally. But what are the programs, and I'm not presuming that I know, what are the programs that are actually designed to change behavior when it comes onto the protection of the environment? If we really believe, and it has to start up here, if we really believe that the value that we place on the natural environment is not based solely on science. It's based on many things. It's based on social value. It's based on aesthetic value. It's based on subsistence value. So there are different models that are being used to determine what's the value to the environment. So for example, where I'm from, there's a time where we had a lot of ship groundings, meaning ships are leaving the harbor. They are supposed to go out with a pilot, which is a little boat that actually says pilot. And it takes you through the reefs and it takes you out. So these ships decide to leave without the pilot. And then they run aground the reef. And so you have damage to the reef. And then we want to take action in court and we want to sue because we want to claim for the reef. We want to say you have damaged the reef, but what is the value? Who places that value? The reef is not sold in the supermarkets. What's the value of the reef? The reef serves many purposes. It protects you from hurricane surges. It is home for fish. If you take them out, then you're going to have an impact on the entire marine environment. So how do you place a value on that? So there have been different models that have been developed to place a value on the environment. But again, that's our value. This is saying, let us look beyond the value that we place. And let us recognize that there is an inherent value. So perhaps there won't be a monetary figure on it, but recognize that there is an inherent value and that the universities must put themselves in this position to influence societies, influence the global discourse on how it is that we can use our space, our intellect, and our resources to have this kind of change. So if we are to expand the social elements of the discourse and focus on the environment, then corporate environmental responsibility would be that which is focused on the environment rather than persons and communities. And that's really what we're saying. Now, the truth is, you can't separate. So whilst you can identify the environment, you really can't separate it from the communities, because communities actually depend on the environment. So that's why you get the concept of subsistence value. So fishermen, for example, will place a value on the environment because their subsistence value. They're getting the fish, and we are the consumers, we are buying the fish. And we need to know that what we are buying are not fish from waters that are so contaminated with persistent organic pollutants that we are eating fish that the pollutant is bioaccumulating in our bodies, because that really also happens. So, what is the dino experiment? This has nothing to do with dinosaurs. And I put it there particularly. So, in Jamaica, sorry I didn't take a map. So on the north coast, there's a parish called Falmouth, Trelawney rather, sorry. And Falmouth is the capital town. Now, there is a phenomenon. It's called glistening waters. And you can Google it. Now, glistening waters, really what it is, it's a body of water. It's just a general part of the marine environment, but it's in this bay. And in the night, if you go on the lagoon and you trouble the water, it glows. It just glows, and it has a blue, fabulous glow. So in the nights, you see bus loads of persons, Jamaicans and tourists, who go just to experience this animation, this light show. Beautiful. But guess what? The research is not definitive as to what maintains the bioluminescence. And so close to the bay is a cruise ship development, which came in a few years ago, right? And actually, there's a presentation that I have online. If you were actually to Google my name and put in something like Falmouth, it will come up, where I basically, it's a presentation that talks about the juggler and the way in which we juggle environmental issues with developmental issues within the context of sustainable development. So what happens is, so there's a cruise ship terminal, and so you have to do a lot of dredging. And dredging is really creating a ship channel. So you know, on the outside and outside you can see the roads. In the sea there are roads. We call them ship channels. We can't see them, but the mariners, they know where these channels are. And so you had to dredge, and therefore in dredging, you'd also be having an impact on the marine environment. So technically, how you really do it is, you would have done an environmental impact assessment. I think we all know that is a tool we use these days. So everything needs an environmental impact assessment. And the purpose of the EIA is to determine the impact of your activity on the environment. So that is one major tool that is used to determine whether or not you carry out this activity or not. Now, the reality is that in many instances, when the developer comes and when the government is trying to juggle its own imperatives and is trying to deal with other issues, poverty alleviation, providing housing, providing infrastructure, then you are going to have an impact on the environment. And so your environmental impact assessment is supposed to determine what is that impact. And in many instances, by the way, it's not even the impact, it's the likelihood of. So in another sense, the environmental discourse has really gone on its own trajectory. Because ordinarily, in a court of law, you need to prove injury. I can't go to court and say, my neighbor would have chopped off my neck if something didn't happen. That's not the issue. the issue may be one of threat because he put me in reasonable fear of bodily harm. But I can't, so that's a threat. But the issue for the environment is that you can have a matter in the court for likely injury to in other words, you don't know if it's going to happen. It's not based on mere conjecture, of course, because you have to have some science behind it. But you can go to court on the likelihood of. And so that's what the environmental impact assessment is all about. It's not about the impact that has occurred, because you haven't carried out the activity yet. It is about the impact that is likely to occur if you do. And if the impact is likely to occur, but you have to carry out this activity, what do you do to mitigate the impact? So if you have to, like for example, this example in Jamaica, so in the dredging, we had to remove coral reefs. And so the mitigating factor was to replant them. So you replant them, but you replant them elsewhere. If you're, so for us, as an island that is dependent a lot on the tourism sector, there are many things that we do that perhaps, if we didn't have to, we wouldn't. So you want to go to Jamaica, you want to go to the beach. Everybody wants to go to Jamaica because there's a beach, right? There's sun, sea, and sand. But when you go to the beach and you go swimming, you really don't want to go walking in the seagrass beds, because in the seagrass beds there are sea urchins. These are the things that stick in the bottom of your feet. So what do? The tourists want to come and the tourists want to swim. And so you say, okay, let's remove the seagrass beds. So that's what you do. You remove the seagrass beds and you remove the entire biota. Because, and then you may replant them. That is your mitigating factor. And it's not just a small island developing thing. It happens everywhere. If you remove one part of the environment, then you try to replicate it elsewhere. It doesn't always work. But so in essence, there is an impact on the environment. So you remove trees. So you have tree planting programs. So you need to plant trees. Because we have impacted the environment so many ways because we have removed the cover. And remember, when you remove tree cover, you're not just removing trees. You're removing habitats. You're removing the habitat for birds who are migratory, who travel from North America to the Caribbean. Hey, you're not the only ones who want a holiday. So when they travel distances and you remove their habitat, you're actually not just impacting their flight path, because they do have their own navigation systems, you're also impacting their own ecosystem, and you're impacting the populations. Because what do they do? Where do they go? So you come to Jamaica to your usual hotel out by pedagogies, and hey, guess what? It's gone. There's no Google to find where's the next accommodation. So you are actually affecting a whole, you're really disrupting a whole ecosystem there. All right, good. So going back to this experiment, so what is happening is that 3 universities are coming together. The UBC, University of the West Indies, and University and Trondheim Art Academy in Norway. So 3 universities are coming together to take a look at the space. And the whole idea behind it is looking at the dinoflagellates. Okay, by the way, that's the marine, those are the marine organisms that are responsible for these light shows. They're called dinoflagellates. So the issue is, what is it that causes them to maintain their glistening? How are the development activities around impacting them? How is it impacting livelihoods? What is the traditional knowledge surrounding the bioluminescence? If you go, for example, and if you talk to the fishermen, they have an idea. They will say to you, well, since the development has occurred, the glistening has lessened. But then you have to corroborate that with the science behind it. So it's combining the science with the traditional knowledge and looking to see how do we incorporate all of this. So how does art, what role does art play in this? Art is a form of expression. And therefore, we're going to use the artistic impression to send the message out as part of the communication. And we see this as part of our corporate environmental responsibility by 3 universities coming together. And the idea is that we will also impact thought changes and impact behavior eventually. Just quickly, green rankings in terms of ranking universities is also something that's being done globally. And in Indonesia, for example, they have also included us as part of their rankings. Say no, you're a student and you want to decide which university you go to. When you do your research, you want to see how is the university ranked. All right? So this is another area that is being explored. And I'm suggesting also that this is a very good way to do it. So it goes into research strategy, and of course I'll give you the paper and tell you what the hypothesis is. And in concluding, I'm suggesting that Christopher Stone's proclamation that rights should be accorded to natural objects has not only found root in the environmental discourse and discourses in sustainable development, but has been the pivot of the development of law, jurisprudence, and practice. Regardless of the dissensions, it is imperative that we see ourselves as the beneficiaries of our own self-destructive plans, and that we are the ones to arrest the decline of our own existence. And thank you very much for your time.
We probably have time for about 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, any questions? Yes.
I really love your presentation.
Thank you.
And your style. Very nice, thank you. So I'm thinking of a couple things. So we're in this historical moment, right? And we're seeing this develop, Ecuador, Bolivia, and then, so I guess I'm kind of wondering, what kind of teeth are we getting here in the law and people actually starting to use this? And I've also been following a little bit in the United States where these teenagers are bringing the government to court for climate change, like we deserve to have a healthy climate in our future. And the Trump administration is pushing back, and the Supreme Court recently said, no, you can't push back, these teenagers have a right to. I don't know. So I'll just leave it there if you have any comments.
Okay, well, General, good point. There actually is a climate change decision. I think it's out, I'm not sure which is this jurisdiction, but there has been a climate change decision out already, that where the court really mandated that the state has a right to ensure that the climate change discourse continues and that the impacts on climate change are arrested. So yes, in terms of teeth, I think that's very important, and I think that's why when you look at the constitutions, it's not just according a right to the natural object, but it is saying what the corresponding right of the human being is. And when you look at them, it talks about the right of the state, the obligation of the state, and the obligation of persons, and it also talks about the obligation of juridical persons. And remember, the juridical persons are like corporations. A company has legal personality, and so a company is a person in law, and therefore also the responsibility of your corporations.
With the proclamation that natural objects should have standing, if it's that they should have the standing in the same way that a human being does, I'm just wondering whether there would be any value in their rights kind of being written differently and having different rights to humans, just because of the example you gave about environmental impact assessments and how the fact that that's only assessing a likelihood, which when you compare it to kind of a human interaction of the same thing wouldn't have as much gravity as a kind of crime.
Okay, that's a very interesting question, because the way the environmental legislation has developed is that you actually have environmental crimes. So if you were to just Google your own local environmental jurisdiction law, it actually makes it an offense to do certain things. So for example, it may be an offense that you're carrying out an activity and you don't have a permit, for example. That's an offense. In fact, the fines for environmental offenses are very high, especially in Canada. They are very high, and the idea is that they should be a deterrent. So the fact that you have to pay, and remember too, that we spoke about the profile of corporations. When you look at my paper, it will talk about even your impact on the stock exchange. So corporations really do not want to get bad judgments against them. Corporations don't want to be fined big, hefty fines because it goes against your own goodwill within society. And so you don't want to do it. So there is a way in which you can use the jurisprudence and you can use the legislation to almost change behavior. You can do that. In Jamaica, for example, recently, so we have banned styrofoam, and we have banned the importation of single-use plastic bags, and we have banned plastic straws, and we have banned... So my kids come and say, but Mom, how are we going to drink? So I say, when I was a child, I know what a paper straw looks like. So that means I'm pretty old. But there actually is something called a paper straw, right? Not a plastic straw. So how are we going to work that out? Is that as of a certain date, you can't import them. So in other words, in Jamaica in the next couple of years, they will become obsolete. So we will hear that there was something called a styrofoam box, then perhaps you sit in a museum. But then there'll be none. So you actually have to use a system. Now, there's a very important principle in the environmental discourse that's called a precautionary principle. And what the principle really says, in essence, is in the absence of scientific certainty, the decision maker should err on the side of caution. So that's really what it means. That is an overarching principle that's found in almost every multilateral environmental agreement. So basically, so how it's played out is another question. So it goes back to the question of the teeth. So that has to be implemented, because really what it's saying is, even when your environmental impact assessment comes up short and shows you that you perhaps, the regulatory agency does not have sufficient scientific information to make a decision of its own, then you really should say no to the development. And so when you look at the terms of reference for an EIA, it actually speaks to alternatives. What are the alternatives? But again, in reality, when you invite an investor into your country and you say, I'm giving you 50 acres of land here, and you purchase 50 acres of land, you expect to do something on the 50 acres of land. So what countries actually do in many instances is this whole concept of mitigation plays a very important role, because the concept of mitigation suggests, and I'm not saying it does, I'm saying it suggests that you can mitigate these impacts. And so this whole replanting of ecosystems, in quotation marks, is one way in which you mitigate impacts. Or you literally just really put in basic infrastructure to mitigate impacts. And some really will work. So for coastal development, for example, you can put in coastal defense works that will prevent coastal erosion. So that would be a mitigating factor. But then what you really have to do is to enact laws and policies that make it prohibitive for the developer to engage in activities that are going to have a negative impact on the environment. And again, I will go back to us as the consumers and the beneficiaries. We are writing our own wills, and guess what? Soon there'll be nothing to put in there, because there'll be nothing to give. So unless we really have these serious introspections and translate those introspections to behavior, to change in behavior, which we are being forced to do now, in any event. And I want to say that before I close, when you read on the real impacts of climate change on our lives, it really is phenomenal. Because if you think about it, you live in a temperate climate, I live in a tropical climate. Temperate climates are having, say, summers, longer summers, hotter summers. We are going to have more dramatic natural disasters. So all of that goes to even the various systems that we depend on. If it's going to impact the marine environment, it's going to impact what we depend on the environment for. It's going to have an impact on the living systems in the marine environment. It's going to have an impact on the plants that we grow, because plants in temperate countries are there because of the climate. So if your climate gets hotter, then it simply means it's going to have an impact on your plants. And then when you look back, I think it was Bolivia that talks about the whole issue of the genetic modification. That's why you also have to have new varieties of plants. So we may not all die, but certainly we're going to live in a changing world. And in closing, I really want to say that a lot depends on me and you. We may think that we're insignificant, but we are not, because numbers count, and we can make the change.